Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing valvular heart disease. Okay, so we're currently in the process of discussing acute rheumatic fever. So I think it would be nice, before we go any further with the pathogenesis of acute rheumatic fever, to discuss where we've got to so far to summarise. So, we have discussed that acute rheumatic fever is a rare complication of Group A beta hemolytic streptococcus pharyngitis, also called strep throat. And it's a rare complication of strep throat that can only occur, we believe, in certain genetically susceptible individuals. We also believe that we also think at present that this M protein is incredibly significant, and that you need not only to be genetically susceptible in order to get acute rheumatic fever from a strep throat, but also to actually have a strep throat which involves group A beta hemolytic streptococcus bacterial cells with a high expression of this M protein. So the pathogenesis follows as so. What happens is when you get the strep throat, you're going to produce lots of antibodies against epitopes of the antigens of the Streptococcus pyogenes bacterial cells. It's then believed in that people who get acute rheumatic fever, you get cross-reactivity of some of these antibodies to self-proteins. And if you believe this M protein theory, we think it's the M antibodies, the anti-M antibodies, the antibodies produced against the M protein in these genetically susceptible individuals that can now actually bind to self-proteins and therefore begin an autoimmune disease. So, all of the consequences then of acute rheumatic fever come from these antibodies attacking self-proteins and setting up inflammatory responses wherever those self-proteins are. So one of the places where these self-proteins seem to be is in the synovial joints. So in 80% of people who are going to get acute rheumatic fever, you get arthritis, inflammation of the joint. So what happens is that the antibodies go into the synovial joint, and they will bind to the self-proteins. You'll get immune complexes forming in the synovial joint, and these will activate the type A synoviocytes, which are also called the synovial macrophages, which are sentinel cells of the synovial membrane, to begin an inflammatory response. So they'll release tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-1, which will trigger inflammatory response in the microvasculature and therefore will lead to the swelling of the joints, also called arthritis. You'll also get arthralgia because a lot of the other mediators, such as prostaglandin E2 is a very famous one, will act on the pain neurons that innervate the synovial membrane and will get them to fire action potentials regularly, which will give you the sensation of painful joints. The fever comes from interleukin-6, which is released at sites of inflammation, which will go up to the brain, increase body temperature, specifically by acting on this area called the hypothalamus, which is an ancient portion of the brain, and that will trigger a fever. Okay, so we now understand why it's called rheumatic fever, because most cases involve the joints and you'll get a fever. We now want to discuss the other places in the body that can be affected. Now, I'm going to discuss two places before I come to the heart, which are very, very rare. They're much rarer than the heart and the synovial joints. The heart and the synovial joints are the major places that are affected in acute rheumatic fever. But I want to come to the heart last, because that's obviously the major one we're interested in, so I'll spend a bit of time on there. I'm now going to go through the other two places reasonably quickly. So, other places then that are affected. We'll go to the most terrifying one at the moment, which is the brain can be affected. So you can get an inflammatory response, an autoimmune inflammatory response occurring within the brain. And this will be set off exactly as I've described for the synovial joints. So you'll get immune complexes being formed, and again, we don't know what the self-protein that these antibodies are cross-reacting with is. Those will activate sentinel cells within the brain. They won't be called type A synoviocytes anymore. They'll be called something different. They'll be one of the glial cells within the brain that are amongst the neurons. And these will set off the inflammatory response again by releasing tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-1. You'll get inflammation in this area of the brain, and that will disturb the function of that area of the brain. So which area of the brain is it that gets affected? Well, it's an area called the corpus striatum. So let me do a little bit of drawing to show you where the corpus striatum is, and then I'll give you a very basic answer of what the corpus striatum does. So let me now draw a picture then of the brain. So this is a very familiar picture. So this is the cerebral hemispheres viewed from the left-hand side. So we're specifically looking at the left cerebral hemisphere. And then poking out from underneath, you'll have the bottom of the brainstem. So here's the pons, the medulla, and then the spinal cord below. And of course, you'll also have the cerebellum here. So here's a picture of the brain. Now the corpus striatum is not the easiest part of the brain to actually find on a picture like this, because it's actually deep inside the cerebral hemispheres. You have two corpus striatums. You have a left one and a right one. I'm going to draw the left one in here because we're looking at the left hand side, but there'll be a mirror image of it on the right hand side. And they're deep inside the cerebral hemispheres, so you'd have to bury deep in here. You'd have to take a drill, bury deep in here, and then you'd find the left corpus striatum. Equivalently, if you went onto the right cerebral hemisphere and buried deep in, you'd find the right corpus striatum. So let me now draw what it looks like. So this is right at the centre of the cerebral hemisphere. It is not visible on the outside of the brain, and it looks like this. So it has this structure, and it has a tail that curves round like that. So that's my basic picture of the corpus striatum, and it's deep inside the cerebral hemispheres. So this is the left corpus striatum here. And this is the area that's going to be affected in acute rheumatic fever. And I want to emphasize, this is extremely rare. Acute rheumatic fever is an extremely rare consequence of Streptococcus pharyngitis. For the brain to be involved, for the corpus striatum to be involved in acute rheumatic fever is extremely rare. So if you take all the people with acute rheumatic fever, very few of them will have involvement in the corpus striatum. The synovial joints is incredibly common. The corpus striatum, thankfully, is incredibly uncommon. But it is, when it does happen, it has extremely severe consequences. So let me tell you about what this part of the brain actually is involved in doing. It's a really important part of the brain for all sorts of different things, but the one that it's very important in, and which is going to have major consequences that will be apparent in acute rheumatic fever, is in the motor system. And its involvement in the motor system is in deciding which movements are made and which are not. So, the brain devises motor plans all the time, and let me just talk about what is meant by a motor plan. So when you want to make a movement, say you want to pick up a cup of coffee or something, to actually make that movement, you need a huge number of muscle cells to contract at exactly the right amount, at exactly the right times. It's an incredible, coordinated performance, basically, involving a huge number of muscle cells, and they all have to be contracting to the right degree at the right amount of time in order for it all to work. They are under the control of nerve cells, loads and loads of nerve cells. So, in order to get the muscle cells to behave, the nerve cells need to behave. They need to be firing action potentials at exactly the right frequency at exactly the right time. So you need an incredible pattern of action potentials propagating down a collection of neurons all at once. Okay, that has to be generated by the brain. That incredible pattern of action potentials that's generated by the brain that will command muscle cells to contract to exactly the right degree at exactly the right times. That is what we mean by a motor plan, and of course the brain concocts these. So, certain portions of the brain are involved in creating these motor plans, and I'm not going to go over which parts at the moment, but I will go over which parts. I think it will actually make it easier if we go over these parts rather than me just trying to describe it in abstract. So let me draw another one of these pictures where we're looking at the cerebral hemisphere from the left-hand side. So here's a very basic model of the motor system. So I'm not going to draw the full brain, I'm just drawing the left cerebral hemisphere here. Now there's a landmark structure on the brain which is known as the central sulcus of the brain, which is a little fissure down the surface. So this is called the central sulcus, and this is just useful for demarcating where certain portions of the brain are. So, straight in front of the central sulcus, there is a portion of cortex, this bit here, called the primary motor cortex. Okay, so this is called the primary motor cortex. And this contains neurons that connect up to the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord. This contains what we call the upper motor neurons. So, the muscle cells we know are controlled by neurons. Those neurons that control muscle cells directly have their cell bodies in the spinal cord. And they will have their cell bodies in the spinal cord at the level where their axon is coming out of the spinal cord. And I'll just draw a picture of this in a moment. So, upper motor neurons. So, if I draw a simple picture here, here is my skeletal muscle here. So this is the muscle that we're trying to get to contract, and I'll just put some tendons on there to make it look more convincing. So here is a tendon, and here is a tendon, like so. Okay, and now the actual neurons that innervate the cells in this muscle, the muscle cells in this muscle, they have their cell bodies in the spinal cord. So I'll just draw a little part of the spinal cord. So here is part of the spinal cord. So here's the axon of this neuron, and it will go into the spinal cord, and it has its cell body in the spinal cord, like so. This is what's called a lower motor neuron, or an alpha motor neuron, an LMN for short, and upper motor neurons are called UMNs for short. So lower motor neurons are also called alpha motor neurons. So these are the ones that directly control the skeletal muscle cells in a skeletal muscle. Up in the primary motor cortex, you have the cell bodies of the upper motor neurons, and these come down. So here it comes down, and then synapses onto the lower motor neuron and gives it its command. Okay, so this is the primary motor cortex. This, if you like, is the control center for the lower motor neurons. You've got upper motor neurons connecting down to lower motor neurons. So this is a very simple part of the motor system here. It's the bit that actually gives the command to the lower motor neurons. This is not the part that actually devises the motor plans. The motor plan has to come to this part, and then it will be relayed down to the lower motor neurons. The part that actually concocts motor plans is in front of the primary motor cortex, and it's known as the secondary motor cortex, and it consists of two parts, the supplementary motor area and the lateral premotor cortex. So I'll put it here, like so. So the supplementary motor area is at the top, and the lateral premotor area is towards the bottom. So this is the secondary motor cortex. And for short, the primary and secondary motor cortexes are just called M1 and M2. So you call the primary motor cortex M for motor, 1 for primary, and the secondary motor cortex M2, 2 for secondary, and M for motor again. So the secondary motor cortex consists of these two parts. This part up here, which I'm colouring in pink, this is the supplementary motor area, for short, called the SMA. So this is the supplementary motor area, or SMA for short. And then also there is the lateral premotor cortex, which is here in green. So this is the lateral premotor cortex, or lateral premotor area, there in green. And together, both of those areas make up the secondary motor cortex. So the lateral premotor area and the supplementary motor area, they make up the secondary motor cortex. So I'll just draw a few more lines to make it even more crazy. Okay, there we go. And these are the parts that come up with the motor plans. So they concoct the motor plans, and in front of that, this portion of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, this is the part that actually makes the decision to make a movement. So this makes a decision to move. It tells the secondary motor cortex to come up with the motor plan to make this movement, and then the secondary motor cortex gives the motor plan to the primary motor cortex. However, it can only do that with the permission of the corpus striatum. So let me now draw out a little flow diagram here. So over here in orange, this is the prefrontal cortex. This is the bit where we believe consciousness actually lies. So this is the prefrontal cortex, often abbreviated down to the PFC for short. Okay, so this makes the decision to move. It tells the secondary motor cortex to come up with a motor plan, and the secondary motor cortex sends that to the primary motor cortex. However, in order for the secondary motor cortex to send its motor plan to the primary motor cortex, which will then just relay it down to the lower motor neurons and it will actually be initiated, it has to be given permission to do this, and that permission comes from the corpus striatum. So this is where the corpus striatum comes in. So here comes another arrow onto this, and I'll put this arrow in white so it stands out. So the corpus striatum, it gives permission for this portion here to actually be done. Without the corpus striatum giving permission, this passing of the motor plan from the secondary motor cortex to the primary motor cortex cannot go ahead. So what tells the corpus striatum to give permission to the secondary motor cortex to give the motor plan to the primary motor cortex? Well, of course, that will come from the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex does two things. It tells the secondary motor cortex directly to come up with the motor plan, and it also tells the corpus striatum to help the secondary motor cortex and give it permission to send the motor plan to the primary motor cortex. Now, why do you need this sort of gatekeeper then? Well, it's because the secondary motor cortex doesn't just make motor plans that the prefrontal cortex tells it to make. It does make the ones that the prefrontal cortex tells it to make, but it all the time practices by making motor plans that you do not actually want to be initiated. So it's practicing making motor plans. So it makes a lot of junk motor plans that you don't want to be initiated. And those don't go to the primary motor cortex because they don't get permission from the corpus striatum. So when you actually do want a motor plan to go to the primary motor cortex, because the prefrontal cortex commanded the production of that motor plan, the prefrontal cortex also needs to tell the corpus striatum to give the secondary motor cortex the permission to send that motor plan to the primary motor cortex. So the corpus striatum then, it's a gatekeeper. It organizes which movements are made and which are not. It stops movements that are junk from being made, basically, and only lets movements that you actually want to make be made. So this is going to go wrong then in acute rheumatic fever that actually does affect the brain. So if your acute rheumatic fever does affect this corpus striatum, it breaks and you start making movements that you have no intention of making, movements that are junk movements that the secondary motor cortex was just creating to practice. And this gives rise to a condition known as Sydenham's chorea. Spelt like so, Sydenham's chorea, and thankfully this is extremely rare. Now, Sydenham's chorea is also called St. Vitus dance. I believe St. Vitus was a saint of dancing, and therefore Sydenham's chorea is also called St. Vitus's dance because the movements that you make that you had no intention of making, they look like dance movements. So, if the corpus striatum gets involved, then you no longer have this gatekeeper working properly, and you end up with all sorts of movements that you had no intention of making being made, because if this thing doesn't function properly, it might send permission to the secondary motor cortex to send all sorts of motor plans that shouldn't be given permission to the primary motor cortex, and therefore actually initiating those movements. And this is why you get movements that you don't want. So in Sydenham's career, people suffering from this end up making these dance movements, these involuntary dance movements, and it does look as though they're dancing, but they have no control over it. And that's why it's also called St. Vitus's dance. Okay, so thankfully that's a very rare complication of acute rheumatic fever, but it is one that you need to be aware of. Okay, so now let's go to another area that's rarely affected in acute rheumatic fever, but it's one that you should be aware of, which is the skin, and then we'll go on to the heart. So, again, exactly the same thing can happen in the skin. These antibodies that cross-react with self-proteins can end up in the skin. There they can form immune complexes, and then they'll activate sentinel cells in the skin to set off an inflammatory response, so you can get an inflammatory response in the skin. This can produce a rash inside on the skin, which is very characteristic and is known as erythema marginatum. So again, this is a rare part of acute rheumatic fever. Very few people who do get acute rheumatic fever will get erythema marginatum, but it's a symptom that you should be aware of. Now, what does this rash actually look like? Well, it looks like lots of annuli around one another. So let me try and draw a little example of this. So, you don't get a complete rash, you get these annuli of red areas. So, erythema, whenever you see erythema, this means redness of the skin. So here is a erythematous portion of skin here in red, and then you'll have a portion that isn't erythematous, and then you'll have another ring of redness inside, like so, and then another patch where it's not red. So this part isn't red, this part isn't red. So you get these rings of redness, and this is the characteristic skin rash that you can get in acute rheumatic fever. Now, I'll repeat again, it's a rare complication of acute rheumatic fever, so very few people who do get acute rheumatic fever get this rash. Right, so that's what that can happen in the skin in acute rheumatic fever. Finally, let's turn to what can happen in the heart in acute rheumatic fever, and then we'll discuss the long-term consequences of this, which is rheumatic heart disease. So, in the heart, you actually get granulomas forming in acute rheumatic fever, and this is quite common. This occurs in up to 50% of people with acute rheumatic fever. So let me just remind you of what a granuloma actually is. So a granuloma is a lesion, it's a round sphere of white blood cells, and at the centre you have macrophage type white blood cells, and around the outside you have effector T cells. So let me just draw a little picture of this. So here we're taking a cross-section of a granuloma, and as I say, there are two portions, the centre or the core of the granuloma and the outer portion of the granuloma. So let me put on the two different types of cells. So at the centre you will have macrophages, and what's a good colour for a macrophage? I'll have this pink colour here. So here's a macrophage, here's another macrophage, here's another macrophage, etc. More and more macrophages. So at the centre you have macrophages. So this is a granuloma that we're drawing here. And it has a core which is made up of macrophages, and those are those pink cells there. Now, in the granulomas that form in rheumatic fever, which are specifically called rheumatic granulomas, and these specifically form in the heart in rheumatic fever, they have another name. They are known as Aschoff bodies, and the macrophages have a specific name as well. So let me give you these pieces of terminology then. So, in the heart, in 50% of people with acute rheumatic fever, you get these rheumatic granulomas, which are also called Aschoff bodies, in fact, more commonly called Aschoff bodies. The core consists of macrophages, as is normal for a granuloma, and those macrophages have a specific name in the case of Aschoff bodies, and they're called Anichkov cells, spelt like so, Anichkov cells. So those pink cells in the centre are the Anichkov cells, but they are just macrophages. They're extremely plump macrophages, so they have a huge amount of cytoplasm. Right, Round the outside then you're going to have effector T cells. So I'll draw these here in blue. Now you have to remember that when we initiate an adaptive immune response, we do not just produce antibodies, you also produce a huge number of effector T cells. So although we have concentrated completely on the antibody side of the adaptive immune response, if you've had antibodies produced that cross-react with self-proteins, you must also get effector CD4 positive T cells produced that have cross-reactivity with self-proteins. And that's what's happening in the heart. Here are some of these effector CD4 positive T cells, because if you remember your immunology, in order to get the activation of B cells, you have to have effector CD4 positive T cells activated against a fragment of the same antigen that the antibodies are going to be directed against. So that's what these are here. So these are effector CD4 positive T cells that have been created against the strep throat. So they've been created against the Streptococcus pyogenes, and these will be directed against fragments of antigens of Streptococcus pyogenes, and now they are cross-reacting with self-proteins just like the antibodies are cross-reacting with self-proteins. So we believe that what happens in the heart is, just as we've described before, initially the antibodies will come in to regions of the heart, they will bind to a self-protein, then you'll get an immune complex that will activate sentinel cells and start an inflammatory response. That will bring in these macrophages and these effector CD4 positive T cells, and then these things set up this granuloma. They're attacking some self-protein. That's why you set these things up. There'll be some self-protein at the center here that they don't like at all, and they're attacking it effectively, and they've formed these incredible arrays of cells. And what is actually happening is the macrophages are at the center attacking whatever the self-protein is that they think is so terrible that the immune response is cross-reacting with. And then around the outside you've got the effector CD4 positive T cells, and although I've just drawn 6 here, they would go all the way around, screaming instructions in at them, releasing all sorts of molecules to stimulate them. So we do not completely understand exactly how these things are produced. What we do understand is that in acute rheumatic fever, you have got cross-reactivity of the adaptive immune response, and in the heart, it's not just the antibodies that are important, it's also the effector CD4 positive T cells. The antibodies most likely initiate the inflammatory process in the heart, but then you get these granulomas forming, which are formed fundamentally by the effector CD4 positive T cells. They are the things which are commanding the macrophages at the center, and they are the reason that this sort of a lesion forms. Okay, so finally let me just remind you that they are called Aschoff bodies, these granulomas that you form in the heart, and they form all over the heart. So they'll form in the middle of the heart muscle, all over the place in the heart, and they can form in the heart valves, and this is what can lead to rheumatic heart disease. So these things can form in the heart valves. Now, in the actual phase where you've got acute rheumatic fever, what this will mean is that you get lesions of the valves. You'll get blobs forming in the valves. So if I just draw a picture, let's say we've got the mitral valve. So if I draw a little picture of the mitral valve. So here is the mitral valve outlet viewed from above. Here is the anterior cusp, and then we've got the posterior cusp with its 3 scallops here, the anterolateral scallop, the intermediate scallop, and the posteromedial scallop. Okay, so in the actual phase where you've got the acute rheumatic fever, what you'll get is little granulomas forming in the valve cusps, like so. Then when the acute rheumatic fever goes away, and I should say that all of this does go away, it calms down. Once the streptococcus pharyngitis is gone and dealt with, the immune response does somehow, and we don't understand how, it turns itself off. Even though it's continuously attacking self-antigens, somehow it realizes that actually we are attacking ourselves here. We should stop this, and it doesn't regenerate itself. So if you did actually have a pathogen present and you were failing to eliminate it, the immune response would be continually restarting. You'd be getting more and more of the CD4 positive T cells being produced continuously, more B cells and plasma cells being produced. That doesn't happen in acute rheumatic fever. You don't continue up the autoimmune response. So that's good. And indeed, in other autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, for instance, that doesn't happen. The immune response just keeps going and going and going and going, and it never goes away. In acute rheumatic fever, thankfully, the immune response doesn't keep renewing itself and does turn off. So after the streptococcus pharyngitis is dealt with, it doesn't renew itself after that. So you just have to wait until it's completely gone. The signs of the immune response have gone. So all of the cells have been cleared that were created against the group A beta hemolytic streptococcus, and then the symptoms of acute rheumatic fever will go away. Okay, the problem is that this might happen to you again. So once it's happened to you once, it can then happen again because, of course, if you get another group A beta hemolytic streptococcus pharyngitis, you've still got the genetic susceptibility and you can get the whole thing happening again. Now, how does this lead to rheumatic heart disease? Well, when you have these rheumatic granulomas forming in the heart, even though they will go away after the acute rheumatic fever ends, it leads to fibrosis. After they go away, you get fibrosis. It thickens the heart valve cusps. And if that occurs multiple times, then you're going to get gradual accumulation of that fibrosis, and that can lead to these becoming less mobile, and therefore it can lead to the stenosis of the heart valve, and that's how you can get rheumatic heart disease. So rheumatic heart disease is the long-term consequence of the fibrosis that can occur in the valve cusps, particularly of the mitral valve and the aortic valve, due to these rheumatic granulomas forming in an episode of acute rheumatic fever. Okay, so we'll have a break here. That finishes the topic of rheumatic heart disease. In the next video, we'll go on to the topic of infective endocarditis.